Okay, this is the this is our third lecture. We've kind of spilled over into lab a little bit, trying to get ourselves going here, and hopefully we'll come close at least to finishing this chapter today, although I won't guarantee anything. So y'all have seen your brains in lab. I assume you've cut them in half and taken a look at this sagittal section, which you see here. And, I'll just tell you that I don't try to make a big deal of having you learn every single little thing, although I think most of the stuff that's on that picture right there is you probably ought to be able to identify on a practical exam. Indeed, on the practical exam, there will be a couple of brains laid out. And some of them you'll be looking at this side of it. There'll be an A, B, C stuck in different things. And you should be able to identify those. And just so you know, I'm not going to put the pins in little tiny things, because the sheep brains are small, and we also have half brains that are human-sized models that work just as well. But you ought to know those structures that we've talked about so far, and kind of there they are. Okay, so let's talk about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is this area right up in here, and the hypothalamus connects with the infundibulum, which you see right here. Normally the pituitary gland would be hanging right here, but as I've told you, we almost never get the pituitary gland because they have to really dissect it very carefully to preserve it and pull it out intact for a specimen. The hypothalamus, I've told you, is very important in the association of the nervous system, which is kind of the quick reflex system of our body, and the endocrine system, as it illustrates right here. And hypothalamus also controls a lot of the autonomic functions. It also secretes a couple of hormones that you ought to know about: ADH, anti-diuretic hormone, and oxytocin, the love hormone, I'm told. So it also has things to do with emotions, thirst center, hunger center, helps regulate your body temperature. You remember we started talking about body temperature on day 1 of A&P. We talked about things like shivering to keep ourselves warmer. We talked about sweating, make ourselves cooler. We talked about redistribution of the blood supply. So if you're too warm, you send your blood out to the surface so it can kind of act like a radiator and get rid of heat. And if you're cold, your vessels shrink down and you don't send much blood out to the surface to keep the body temperature warm. Also the circadian rhythm. Man, I am always amazed. You listen to TV and there's a drug for everything now. You've seen some drug about non-24 that's on TV, and it's a drug that attacks this circadian rhythm. We wake up in the morning and sometimes we're a little sleepy, but usually we feel pretty good, and then as the day goes on, we sort of get sleepy come nighttime. Our body is on a 24-hour clock, and we do get used to that. That's controlled here in the hypothalamus. The limbic system is another system that doesn't really have a very, it's not something you're going to see a pin in, because it's really a system that works between both the hypothalamus and the cerebral cortex. It helps us with our memory storage and retrieval of things. It helps us maintain an emotional state. Let's just call it good at that. Let's now go to the main part of the brain, which is the cerebrum, which is what you really think of as your brain. It's the part on top, and it controls everything that you think about, all your intellectual functions, and it processes motor and sensory information as well. And so when I take and reach my hand out to grab this bottle here, that's my cerebrum moving my arm out, and it's also my cerebrum that when I touch that and the sensations come back to my cerebrum. We'll talk about the different regions of the cerebrum here in a minute. Remember that as opposed to the spinal cord, the cerebrum, the gray matter is on the outside. Remember, in the spinal cord, the gray matter was on the inside. And so just remember that. And remember what makes gray matter gray?
Cell bodies.
Cell bodies, that's right. So the white matter is down below it. It's all the axons, the myelinated axons mostly, that are carrying information around. This is a view of the cerebrum here. And most of the lobes are named after the bones that are under them. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Please notice that there's two major sulci. One is called the central sulcus, and it goes kind of down like this. And just so you know, when you look at some of these models and you look at some of the brains, it's really hard to say exactly what the central sulcus is, because sometimes it looks like it comes up to here and then it breaks and goes over to there, and it's not a very clear delineation, I don't believe. The thing that's important about the central sulcus is that it's a good guideline to the two, probably the most important parts of our cerebrum, and that is the precentral gyrus in front and the postcentral gyrus in back. Now, what's the importance of those two regions? Anybody know? Motor and sensory, yeah. Now, which one's which? Hard to remember, isn't it?
Is the post the sensory?
I don't know. Well, here's the way I always remembered it. Take it for what it's worth. When I was a young man, we used to go parking. We called it parking. I don't know what y'all call it now. You probably call it hooking up or something. But you'd sit in the front seat of the car, okay? And in the front seat of the car, you know, that's where you drive, right? So that's where you use your muscles to turn the wheel and to shift the gears. You don't do that anymore, but basically the motor is in the front seat. Now later, when you would be parking and you were really getting into that sensory stuff, you'd get in the back seat. Okay?
Oh,
So, I know it's a dumb example, but the precentral gyrus is motor. That's where all the motor controls of your body are. They're the somatic motor controls. They're in the precentral gyrus. And the postcentral gyrus, this gyrus running right behind the central sulcus, is where the sensory control is. So, if you had a stroke, okay, in other words, you had a blockage of the blood supply to a piece of your brain, and it was a piece that was blocked, and say it was this area of your brain right there, what would your symptoms be?
or motor coordination.
Motor. So you'd be paralyzed. You couldn't move the muscles in a certain region of your body. We'll talk about the regions a little more clearly in a minute. But if your stroke was back here, it would be
Sensory.
you'd be numb. Yeah, it would be a sensory deficit. Now, most strokes, honestly, especially if they're pretty good-sized strokes, they're going to involve both areas. Okay, and so then you've seen lots of stroke victims that are both paralyzed. They're also numb on the same side. Now, if they had their stroke on this side of their brain, they're paralyzed and numb on the opposite side. It's always the opposite side that controls things with your brain and your body. Okay. You notice here it talks about the branches of the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery, which comes off of the circle of Willis that we talked about, sends blood to this whole area. And indeed, that's where most strokes occur, I guess because the middle cerebral is the biggest of the areas. Here's a closer, nice colorized view that tells us, delineates things better for us. But here's your precentral gyrus that we just talked about, and your postcentral gyrus, and between them is the central sulcus. The other sulcus that you need to know about is this one here called the lateral sulcus. It goes this way, and you see it basically divides the temporal lobe kind of below from the frontal lobe and parietal lobes up above. Now, how many of you saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Great show. They did some brain surgery in that movie. You remember that? What did they do?
Frontal lobotomies?
They did a frontal lobotomy. Wow. You mean they just sucked McMurtry's frontal lobe out? Yes, that's what they did.
No, I thought they got a spike now.
Huh?
Oh, they just got a spike now.
No.
No?
They just they drill a little hole,
And
they
they
stick
suck
a
it out.
sucking tube in there, a sucker, and because remember,
It's like Jello.
good brain sucks. That was a rule we used in the OR. If you're trying to decide whether it's tumor or whether it's normal brain, you'd see if it sucked. And if it would suck up, that's a bad story. All right. If we take the parietal lobe off and looks more down towards the midline, there's one other gyrus or one other region of the brain that you don't see from the outside. That's called the cingulate gyrus right here, which runs right across in the middle, across the top. What's this white thing here called?
Corpus
Corpus
callosum.
What does the corpus callosum do?
Allow communication between the two.
Yeah, it's what do we call those? A commissure? It's a commissure thing that carries information from one side of the brain to the other. It's the biggest one. Right there. And what's the little blood vessel that runs right across the top of that thing?
Inferior sinus.
Inferior sagittal
Sinus. Vein. Sinus.
Venus?
sinus, yeah. And what's the name of that fold of dura that it's in?
The falx cerebri.
Bulk cerebri, there you go. Okay. You remember some of it. Here's 3 functional principles of the cerebrum. And this goes back to that left-handed or right brain, left brain thing that you've heard about, and I think I've mentioned. Each cerebral hemisphere receives the information from and sends motor commands to the other side of the body. So the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and vice versa. The 2 hemispheres have different functions, although they look exactly the same. The right brain doesn't look different than the left brain on anatomic slices. They look the same. And this business about right brain and left brain and the correspondence between a certain function occurring on one side versus the other is not precise. You see that? Not precise. So this crap about women are left brain and men are right brain and whatever, I don't even know which is which. But it's just very vague, and don't think you have to remember it. Okay. There is some white matter in the cerebrum. The cerebrum, like I said to start with, is mostly gray matter, but there's some fibers, and I just want you to know about these because there's association fibers that associate one area of the cerebrum to another. There's commissural fibers that go from side to side, right? And there's projection fibers that carry signals up there from lower areas in the brain. Enough said about that. Here we're going to go through them a little more closely. The 2 major sets of commissural fibers that you should be able to identify probably are the corpus callosum, which is the big one we talked about, and the anterior commissure, which is the smaller one. Basal nuclei, they're not really nucleuses. I guess they are because they're gray matter, But we call them nuclei because they're collections of gray matter down in the white matter. And that's really all I think you need to know about them. They direct a number of our subconscious activities that go on without us thinking about it, and let's just leave them at that. Here's an example of basal nuclei. Please do not memorize any of these. There's the corpus callosum that we talked about a minute ago. Here's the anterior commissure, which we talked about. But all of these things, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the head of the caudate nucleus, I just don't think you need to know that. I don't think it is something that you need to know. Notice that when you cut a brain across in this frontal section like that is, you see you cut through the ventricle up here in front, and you also cut through the back tip of the lateral ventricle as well. So you see it twice. Remember, it's kind of a hook on the side, yeah?
So you skipped over this.
I did?
You mean I left the slide out?
There's like three.
There's 3 of them on there.
Oh my gosh, I probably did that on purpose. I do some things on purpose, and taking out slides is something I do on purpose. I'll leave it at that. I was lecturing along one day, and this one girl, she was so irritated at me. She puts up her hand and says, Dr. Sessions, do you know that you have skipped 2 slides and you've got 1 slide out of order? And I'm like, no, I didn't. Sorry. I didn't mean to confuse you. Anyway. But thank you for letting me know. I really, you were nice about it. Anyway, so the motor areas, we've talked about it. It's the precentral gyrus. I think that's enough said. I think when you look at the cerebrum under the microscope, about the only 2 things you ought to be able to know about that slide is, first of all, that it's neural tissue, and it kind of looks different. And notice that, and there are some pyramidal cells, which are big cells that you should be able to see in there. If you know you're in the cerebrum, you know the big cells are pyramidal cells. So identify those when you look at them under the microscope in lab. The sensory areas are, like we said, the post-central gyrus. They're in the back seat. And so the post-central gyrus involves a lot of things like touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, temperature. Those are all sensations that are coming to that post-central gyrus. There's a couple of areas here that your book does a nice job of giving you pictures that have colored areas for, but it doesn't make sense that our brain sort of partitions itself and keeps the visual cortex where we see separate from the auditory cortex where we hear, from the olfactory cortex where we smell, from the gustatory cortex where we taste. Very good. So, gustation. Every time I see this word gustation, I think of this restaurant in town called Gustav's. I've been there.
Great food.
And it's okay. Yeah, it's a German restaurant, I believe. And they used to have one out in the airport. I'm not sure they still have that anymore. Yeah. But anyway, the one in the airport always cracked me up because we were out there getting on a plane one time, and we got there early, like we usually did. My wife wants to be to the airport at least 2.5 hours early. I think she works for the damn TSA or something. But anyway, so we're sitting there in the restaurant, and there's this guy at the next table, and he orders a beer, a tall beer. And he undoes his shirt a little bit, and he kind of pulls out this Foley catheter. This catheter that was a gastrostomy tube. It was going into his stomach. He'd obviously had some kind of surgery. Maybe his esophagus was boogered up or something. But anyway, he fed himself through this tube. So he takes and pulls out a big syringe, about a 100 cc syringe. He plugs it into his catheter, and he pours his beer into the syringe. And it goes down, and then he fills it up again and again until his beer is all gone, and it's in his stomach. So he plugs it off, clamps it off, wipes it off, tucks it back in his shirt. And I thought to myself, thank God for Goose Station. Thank God for taste. That poor guy didn't get to taste that beer at all. He just poured it straight into his stomach. And so every time I go into Gustav's, I think of that. And you'll never forget it either, will you? All right. So, anyway, here's I wonder how many drank on the plane. I think the only important thing to notice here is that you can kind of peel the temporal lobe down and look back into that lateral sulcus and see these areas delineated. I really don't care that you can identify these very well because they aren't color-coded like this on the brain, just to tell you. About the only one I think you ought to be able to say, yeah, that's where that's located, is the visual, back there in the back of the head, in your occipital lobe. That's where we see, that's where we process our visions together. We'll learn a lot more about that when we get to the special senses. There's also association areas. I don't make a big deal out of these. But if it only makes sense, if you've got this really complex machine called a brain, that it's going to have areas that associate things together, right? And thus, if I'm standing here and trying to stand on one leg, I've got all these messages coming in from my leg and from my balance system, but I've also got a lot of information coming in from my eyes, right? Because I'm seeing everything, and if I start to go over to one side, I'm seeing something different as well. Well, that's what happens in all these association areas. They put the information together. Let's just leave it at that. GIP, or general GIA, general interpretive area, is also called the Wernicke area. This thing here, it says it's only in one hemisphere. That doesn't mean it looks any different from the outside. The general interpretive area is this area that receives all of that sensory information that we were just talking about. Helps us to do complex things, both visually and auditory, and remember things as well. Speech is not an easy thing to learn. It's associated with the general interpretive area, and the prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe does some of this abstract intellectual activities. Now you got to realize that back when doctors and psychiatrists were doing prefrontal lobotomies, we didn't really understand this stuff. And we didn't understand what area of your brain you saw through or what you heard through, because we didn't have the way to like tweak one area of the brain and see and have the patient awake and have them tell us what they felt, right? So this took a long time to work out. And so they were doing prefrontal lobotomies, and they were doing it mostly for craziness. And of course, the problem that old McMurtry had is he pissed off old Nurse Ratched, right? And she said, "Oh, he's crazy. We better get him sent down for a prefrontal lobotomy." Just a great show. I saw it on stage down at the.
How recent is it that they're able to determine like what area of the brain
is doing all these? I would say in the last 15, 20 years. Yeah, not that
I
long.
really asked if my son, who's now 6, started having seizures out of the blue at age 3.
Yeah.
And they can pinpoint like the location.
Absolutely. Yeah, EEGs, which is recording wave frequencies off your head. That is a science that needed the advances in computer technology in order to be able to tie all of those little electrical sparks together to be able to identify things. So a lot of it depended on computer technology advancing, and yeah, it hasn't been that many years. Yeah. Is he doing better?
Yeah, he's been on meds, and we're gonna start weaning this fall.
Cool. Okay, so here's the GIA, the general interpretive area. It's right there at the back end of the lateral sulcus. Speech center, eye field. Most of the eye is back here and back, like I said. Here's that prefrontal cortex that they were sucking out in the old days. And I'll just leave it at that. You don't need to know any of these. These are different areas that have been worked out. I mean, I think it's neat to know that they've been worked out, but you don't need to know that stuff. Let's talk about this right brain, left brain thing. And let me just say this quickly. Most people are left brain dominant. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because I look around the room and most of you are holding your pencils in your right hand. So your right hand is the dominant extremity. Therefore, your left brain is your dominant lobe of your brain. Okay? And indeed, most of us use our dominant hemisphere for reading, writing, math, decision making. And you know, that's like women. You know, women are smart, they make good decisions, they read and they write, they're the poets of the world, they do all the important stuff, whereas guys are pretty much right cerebral hemisphere, and we're pretty much into touch and sight, and really into touch, and we can recognize a few people, but anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Here's this little diagram that's in your book. And notice that here's your corpus callosum down the middle, which is carrying things back and forth, along with your anterior commissure, which is carrying things back and forth. Here's your left side, which is where all this high thinking takes place, writing, speech, and so forth. Right side, not very dominant. I don't know if y'all know this, but the last 3 presidents of the United States, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama are all left-handed. What does that tell you? I don't know, but I'm just mentioning it to you. So they're all left or right brain dominant. Okay, a seizure is a seizure's like an itch. I always think of just remember that a seizure is nothing more than a symptom. Okay, it's caused by a piece of the brain that just starts firing off like crazy. And most seizures start in one little area of your brain, and then they get bigger and bigger and kind of become a grand mal seizure, which means your entire body sort of does this shaking thing. And sometimes they're just very small. Sometimes people have they call petit mal, petite little seizures, and they may be nothing more than the patient goes blind for a second, or the patient falls off to sleep for a few seconds, or loses consciousness for a few seconds. The symptoms depend on the region affected. Most of the time, most seizures are grand mal seizures, and they start in one area and then they just kind of spread to the rest of the brain. We used to think it was really important to shove something down their throat so they wouldn't, quote, swallow their tongue. Nobody swallows their tongue. That was a dumb thing to do. We broke a lot of teeth and screwed up a lot of people's mouths. But if somebody's having a seizure, don't do anything like that. Just maybe roll them on their side so that if they do vomit, they don't vomit and aspirate down into their lungs. But that's the most to do for them. It's going to stop, almost always does. Obviously, if somebody has a seizure, they're going to need a workup. They're going to need an EEG. The EEG is where they put the little leads on the head and try to figure out where the itch area is from. Yeah?
They told us in human development that children that are born with like really severe seizures, they can remove one lobe of the brain before the age of 5, and their brain will
Take over other
their brain
areas.
will develop normally like a
Yeah.
size brain.
You know, it depends on what area of your brain it is. Obviously, if it was your visual area, you wouldn't want to take it out, right?
So would they only take out a part of it then? Maybe not.
Oh yeah, they'd just take a little tiny piece out. That's what's so neat about this localization. They've been able to localize things so that they can just take out a little tiny piece, or even just freeze that part. Sometimes they'll just put a little freezing wand in there and freeze it, which kills the cells around that area. Okay, let's talk about the 12 cranial nerves. It looks like we're to that point. Okay, here's the deal. Our body has 31 sets of spinal nerves, right? C1, C2, C3, down to C8, and then T1 through 12, and on like that. So there's 31 sets of spinal nerves, and there are 12 cranial nerves. Now, what does cranial nerve mean?
Brain nerve. Direct brain.
It just means the nerve comes directly out of the brain. That's the only thing that makes it different in any way. They don't come out of the spinal cord. They come out of the brain. All right. Now, I did medicine for 30 years, and so when I came out here and started teaching at PCC, I thought, man, how am I going to remember all that stuff from way back there? And of all the things that I could remember about the body, I think I probably remembered the cranial nerves better than anything else. And that sounds crazy. But here's why. We had this expression, and it was called, it went like this: on old Olympus's towering tops, a Finn and German viewed some hops. Now, if you're like Dr. Huss in the back of the room, you go and look on Google and you can find the most filthy lines in the world
Oh yeah,
that start with those letters.
military ones.
Yeah. All right. So, I don't know. It just stuck with me. I learned it once, and it's one of the few things I've remembered a long time. So let's just go through it, and if you're writing down notes, this is probably something you might want to think about writing down. What's the first? So these are the cranial nerves. 1, 2, 3. And by the way, we use Roman numerals. Everybody know what Roman numerals are? Okay. It's like how they number the Super Bowls, right?
Indeed.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Okay? 1 through 12. So what's number 1?
Olfactory.
Olfactory. Olfactory. Number 2, optic. Your eyeballs. Number 3, oculomotor. Now, let's just kind of, as we go through these, kind of think, well, what does this one do? Well, this one carries your smell, obviously. This one carries your vision. This is the actual signals of what you're seeing get transferred by your optic nerve back to your brain. Oculomotor, what do you figure it does? Yeah.
Eye movement.
Eye movement, that's right. The oculomotor nerve goes to several of your eye muscles that make your eyes move and look around at different things. Okay? T, trochlear. Think of trochlea as a little pulley, right? And there's one of the eye muscles that runs through a pulley,
Superior.
which is called the superior oblique. How do you like your Apple Watch?
I love my Apple Watch.
Do you?
Yeah.
I'm so frustrated with mine, I had to take it back to the Apple store, and they gave me a pep talk and showed me how to use it. I still can't use
There's
it.
a tutorial on your phone too. So.
Work. Learning.
Anyway, so that's where it gets its name. This muscle here only goes to one eye muscle. It goes to that superior oblique muscle. We'll talk about that when we come back. So then what's T?
Just get an old-fashioned watch.
Isn't this the trigeminal? Why is it called the trigeminal? Anybody?
3 something.
Has 3 major parts, yeah. Trigeminal kind of goes to your face. It's a sensory nerve from your face. And there's one part that goes to the top, and one part to the maxillary area, and one part to the mandibular area down here. So that's where it got its name, and we'll come back to it as well. The A is called the abducens. Now, what does abduction mean?
Take away.
I'll move away from the midline.
Move away from the midline. So your eyes, when they go, let's take this eye right here, when your right eye moves out to the side out there, that's called abduction. Okay? And the muscle that makes your eye move out to the side is the lateral rectus, the one on the lateral side of your eye, that basically when it contracts, it pulls your eye over to the side. Okay? That is the only muscle that nerve 6 goes to.
Which one was that?
Lateral rectus.
Lateral rectus.
Yeah. F, facial. Okay, now, let me just try to help you here, because we just said that the trigeminal was the sensory nerve to your face. So when you touch your face, those messages are sent back to your brain through your trigeminal nerve. Your facial muscle basically goes to the muscles of your face that make you smile and make you close your eyes and all that kind of stuff. Okay? Number 8. It's and, so it's really an A. I should write it and. And that's, this is kind of a hooker for you here. Auditory. We used to call it the acoustic nerve.
Yeah.
And so that's where the A came from. We don't call it that anymore. So that's kind of, you got to remember that one. Okay, the acoustic nerve goes to the ear and allows you to hear, but it also goes to the vestibular organ, which is the semicircular canals and things that allow you to have orientation, get dizzy, and know which way is up, which way is down, feel acceleration and things like that. So really today we call it the, what do we call it? Vestibulo-cochlear, yeah. Vestibulo. Just remember, I'm doing all this out of my head here. Vestibulo-cochlear. And we call it that because the vestibular system is the one that deals with balance and all of that jazz. The cochlea is the part of your ear that hears. Okay? Have you guys know anybody that has a cochlear implant? To me, that is one of the most incredible things ever. I have a good friend who was really deaf his whole life, and he got by with a little sign language, and I think he could hear a tiny bit. Did a lot of lip reading and so forth. But he got a cochlear implant, and he was a Facebook friend of mine, still is, and he would post things like, "I heard birds for the first time in my life today. I heard the rain falling on the outside of the house." And you think about how much hearing adds to your life. It's pretty cool. Anyway, so that's the cochlea. G stands for glossopharyngeal.
Glossopharyngeal.
Or glossopharyngeal. Or glossopharyngeal. All right, what does glosso refer to?
Epiglossal. Tongue.
Your tongue, okay? And your pharyngeal, your pharynx, is your pharynx back in there.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes to a bunch of the muscles that help you swallow and things like that. V
Vegas.
is one of the most important nerves. It's the vagus nerve. It carries mostly messages. It's called the vagus because it's the vagabond. Vagabond. In other words, it's the wanderer. Wasn't there a song like that? The wanderer, he's the wanderer.
He's
Yeah.
the one.
Who sang that?
That's not the wanderer. It's anyway, I'll get back to it.
Okay. Get back to me on that one. Yeah, the vagus nerve is vagus. It's number 10. It carries vagus nerve goes to your heart and your lungs and your intestines. It makes your heart beat slower. It does all kinds of things. And that's one of the problems they thought I was having for my years of fainting, was I was having vagal attacks, where the vagus fires off too much and it slows your heart rate down until you pass out. Anyway. And then there's S, some hops, and S stands for the spinal accessory. S-P-I-N-A-L, accessory. Now you may see it listed as just the accessory nerve, okay? But it's also called the spinal accessory because it's kind of funny, because some of the little rootlets actually come out of the spinal cord, and then they kind of head back up and meet up with others from the brain itself. And so number 11 is called the spinal accessory nerve, and I know that Melissa refers to that as the nerve. Because it innervates your trapezius muscles and a number of these muscles in the back of your neck that basically raise your shoulders up. And then H is the hypoglossal, and we've already done a little bit of tongue over here with the glossopharyngeal. The hypoglossal, this is the main nerve that controls your tongue. Okay? Now, there's another thing that I think you ought to tie in with this, because this helps a lot.
Sensory or motor?
Yeah. All right. Some.
Some say marry for money, but
Don't interrupt me here. I've got to get this out of the depths of my brain here. Okay, there's a bunch of letters down there that probably don't mean much to you, but you notice that they are all either S, which stands for sensory, or they're M,
For
which
motor.
stands for muscular, or they're B,
For
which
both.
stands for both. Some say Marilyn Monroe, but my brother says Bridget Bardot. Some say Marilyn Monroe, but my brother says Bridget Bardot. So these are motor down here. The abducens, which makes that eye turn out, it's only motor. The trochlear, which works that one eye muscle, another eye muscle, is muscle only. And the oculomotor, which goes to the other four eye muscles, is called is a motor nerve only. The olfactory, which is obviously bringing sensory information from your smell back, it's sensory. Your optic nerve, which is only bringing vision back, is sensory. Your auditory, or vertebrocochlear, vestibulocochlear, is only sensory. It's bringing in the balance input, and it's also bringing in the hearing input, right? And then the rest are both. And you notice there's only, four of them that are both. The trigeminal, the facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. Now, you should know that those four that are both, usually they're about 95% one and just a tiny little bit the other. But I'll let you learn those. I think you should know the cranial nerves, and I'll tell you that most folks, when they come in to take the next couple of tests on this stuff, they'll just sit and write this down to start with. You know, they'll write the letters and they'll write the sensory motor stuff down there, and that's kind of their little cheat sheet that they write in the corner of their test, which they can answer all the questions from then. Okay?
What was Bridget's last name? I forget. Bardo.
Yeah, see, you guys didn't live through the age of Marilyn Monroe and Bridget Bardot. I think Bridget Bardot, is she still alive? I don't think she looks too bad, even at, she's up there, probably in her 70s now. Yeah, she's about my age, I think. All right. Now, one thing I will not make you do is I will not make you know which hole they come out through of the brain. Okay, so you don't have to know it comes out through the, you know, the jugular canal, or the comes out through the, or some of those holes in the brain, which in the skull, which I never did like to learn. Never did like to make either. You guys learn either. Anyway. Now, here's another picture I want to talk with you about just real quick, and this is a picture of the brain that shows the cranial nerves coming out of it. And let me tell you that that looks so nice, doesn't it? Oh yeah, I can identify those. That's one is the olfactory nerve, and that's one that you should know. You should be able to look at it and see, yeah, oh yeah, that's the olfactory tract. That's number one. And you should be able to identify number two, which is the eyes, the optic nerve, because they cross over here. There's this little thing called the optic chiasm. We'll come back to that. And outside of that, I think it's a stretch for me to ask you to identify any of these nerves, because usually they're about the size of a piece of thread. If there was anyone that was going to be identifiable, it would probably be the trigeminal, because it's the biggest. It's the sensation from your face, right? But I find them all really hard to identify. Not only on the human brain model we have down in the lab, but on the models. Most of the models don't even have them, I don't think. They don't put the cranial nerves on, do they? Yeah. So, but the way I'm going to expect you to know these is because I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about what their functions are and what they do, and what the deficits are if they're not working. Okay? So we'll go through those things as we finish this stuff up. I'm going to run through them one time here, real quick. Olfactory nerve number one. Olfactory nerve, smell, comes from the top of the nose. Remember, up above the superior concha. They do go up through the cribriform plate. Remember that cribriform plate in the ethmoid bone. That one's worth knowing because they're just right there. I think I can just leave that. One thing about the olfactory nerve, and this is different than all the others, this is the only one that goes directly into the cerebrum. Okay? In other words, when you smell something that smells really bad, it goes directly into your brain. And I think you probably have all experienced smells that were so bad in your life that you just like, bleh. You know, how intense smells can be. Every other sensation that we get goes up through the thalamus, synapses, then the thalamus kind of processes it and decides whether to send it on up to the cerebrum or not. But the olfactory nerve is the only one that goes straight to the cerebrum. Yeah?
Why does plugging your nose kind of affect the taste of something? It's like it kind of dulls the
Yeah. All right, well, here's the question for you. If you're eating a steak, okay, are you just tasting the steak, or are you tasting it as well as smelling it?
Both.
It's both, that's right. So what we think of as taste is really not just taste, and that's why if you plug your nose, it doesn't taste the same, because gustation, tasting things, is a combination of both of those senses, really. Haven't you ever had a stuffy nose or a cold and food doesn't taste good? It's because you can't smell. Good question. Here's where they are, right up here above the superior concus. They go through the little cribriform plate into the olfactory bulb, and from there they go right into the olfactory cortex of the cerebrum. They do not stop at go. They do not go to the thalamus or anything like that. Optic nerves number 2, they do nothing but get the information from the retina of your eye. The retina of the eye is the part that sees light, that interprets light and colors and so forth. They come back via the optic chiasm, and let me just show you how this works. Okay, I'm going to erase this. It's in a slide, so I think you're okay. Okay, let's think about seeing things, okay? Now we have 2 eyes, right? And both eyes are looking at something. And what we would really like is for both eyes to be seeing the same thing, right? Because if they're not lined up right, one's out here to the side, and I'm looking at you, I'm going to see 2 of you, right? Because the eyes aren't lined up. Now, how do eyes work in terms of this whole system? Well, think about it like this. Here's your eyeball. Here's your eyeball. Okay, we're looking at it from the top, let's just say. So this is the left eye, and this is the right eye. And the thing you have to remember is that you have to talk about 2 things. One is the visual field, what you're looking at, and the other one is the retinal field. For example, if this left eye is looking at something out here, okay, that thing comes, the light from that comes in through the lens, and it goes over here to this part of the retina, okay? Now, let's say instead of it being here, that it's way up there on the wall, okay? So this eye sees it, and it sees it with this side of the retina, and this one does too, okay? Sees that thing way up there. And vice versa, if there was something up there to look at, this eye would see it over there, and this eye would see it there. Let's stop for a minute and change colors, and let me give you 2 colors, because this is the concept I want you to understand. This one sees that way, and this one sees this way. Okay? So here's the nerve, here's the optic nerve from that half of the eyeball. And we can call this the lateral retina. Notice that the lateral retina here, because here's the nose, you're in the middle, right? Lateral retina is seeing the medial visual field. Just trying not to get those 2 terms confused. They're really not very confusing, but anyway. So this nerve here on this side carries this information back this way. Okay? And this visual field here, this nerve carries things back this way. Now, answer me this question. If you're going to be seeing something out here to the side, and you're going to want both eyes to look at it the same, would it make sense if this part of the vision comes on back here to the brain, and this part goes with it? So that the stuff that you're seeing out that way through this eye, the stuff you're seeing out there through this eye, goes to the same side of the brain to be processed together, put the view together. On the other hand, the stuff you see on here with this part of the retina, you want it to come back, and this part of the retina over here, you want it to come back. And that whole visual field, that half of the visual field, is both going to this side of the brain, right? So what happened here was this thing here is called the optic chiasm. It's basically the optic crossing over part. And the part that crosses over is always the medial retina. So you notice that this red part here, which is on the medial side of the retina, came and crossed over from this side to that side. The medial retina on this side, this blue stuff right here, crossed over and went to the other side of the brain. Does that make any sense to you at all? Okay. That's the optic chiasm. So the stuff that crosses over is the medial part of the retina. The stuff that does not cross over is the lateral. So see this lateral, it just came straight back on the same side. This lateral just came back stayed on the same side. Yes?
And what if the light's hitting the fovea capitis absolutely perfect in both eyes?
Then you see perfect in both eyes. Well, the fovea is just the middle of the retinal field, so it would be coming from this area right here, between the two, and that it'd be the same thing. Yeah,
You actually have a blind spot.
yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to the
So
eye.
if it's right in the middle, if you don't see it.
Huh?
If it hits right on that spot, you don't register anything.
No, that's not right. This is the middle part of your retina, and it sees the best. It's called the macula. The part you're talking about is what's called, is where the optic disc. That's where the nerve comes out, and there's a piece of retina missing. That's the size of your optic disc. We'll get to it when we get to the eye. But it's a blind spot. That's the blind spot. It's not in the middle, it's kind of out to the side. You can find your blind spot if you want to, if you put your hand out here like this. It's a little bit to the lateral side, and it's about that high, and eventually you'll find a place out there where you can't see your hand. We'll do it in lab. We have little tester things allow you to do that in
Yeah, we went to. We need to go 20 slides back.
went through a lot. Yes, ma'am. You're signaling?
We're like 107, 108. You're about like 4 slides less than I have.
Yeah, I want to stop. Time to stop.
Time to stop. Good to go.